Then, with this move in the program, we are now happy to have Professor Adrian Marcu from the University of West Timișoara, Chair of Philosophy, I am repeating myself, of the Victor Babeș University of Medicine and Pharmacy in Timișoara, with a topic which indeed respects the general topic of diversions, manipulations, and religious conflicts in the history of Romania, within the framework of the religious history of Romania. And once again, your title, welcome to the Institute for the History of Religions. The title is Fundamentalist Reconfiguration of Orthodoxy and the Justification of Political Violence in Legionary Thought. And I allowed myself to add, in the original legionary thought, not the revival of the 90s, but the legionary thought of the interwar period. So please, you have 20 plus minutes. You use it as you wish, with perhaps some Q&A, and afterwards I invite you, those here in Bucharest, at the premises of the Institute for the History of Religions, for concluding with the presentation of the multi-annual project, because we do have some manuscripts, some unpublished, some just starting to be published this year, and several books which is the basis for building on this research. So, Professor Marcu, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm beginning with this kind of text about the fundamentalist reconfigurations of Orthodoxy and the justification of political violence in legionary thought, because it's an issue very well known for some people, of course, who are specialized in the field. But there is still a lot of few things known by the entire population, not only of Romania, but even of the European population. And we are living now times of crisis when the Western far right is now increasing everything everywhere in the Europe. So I guess that article will be very proper for our audience right now. So I will start from the abstract. The paper starts from the fairly simple question: how did Orthodox Christianity come to be used in certain interwar Romanian context in ways that could support and even make a sense of political violence? Rather than treating Orthodoxy as a stable doctrinal system, I look at how it appears in legionary writings as something more flexible, at times selectively invoked, and often folded into a broader ideological vocabulary shaped by nationalism, anti-modernism, and appeals to tradition. Reading a number of texts associated with the movement, what becomes noticeable is not so much a coherent theological position, but a gradual shift in how familiar concepts are used. Terms like tradition, nation, sacrifice, or even salvation begin to carry an increasingly different weight. They are not abandoned as religious ideas, but they are no longer confined to a strictly spiritual register either. Instead, they start to overlap with political language, sometimes subtly, sometimes quite directly. I'm not suggesting that Orthodox doctrine as such leads to violence, which would be misleading. What seems more plausible is something less direct, that certain conceptual ambiguities, especially when combined with strong ideological commitments, can make particular interpretations available, interpretation in which violence becomes easier to frame as meaningful or even necessary. Seen this way, the legionary case is less an isolated anomaly and more revealing example of a broader problem. For this reason, the legionary movement case can be read as a particularly clear example of how religion's language is reconfigured within a political framework. The starting point and question of this paper is decisively simple, and perhaps for that very reason difficult to answer in a straightforward way. How did Orthodox Christianity, in the Romanian interwar context, become entangled, at least in certain discursive and ideological configurations, with forms of political violence that were not merely tolerated, but at times rendered meaningful? There is not a question about doctrine in the strict theological sense, nor is an attempt to derive political consequences from orthodoxy as a religious system. Rather, is a question about use, or more precisely, about a reconfiguration, about how a set of religious concepts, symbols, and sensibility was gradually reinterpreted within a political framework shaped by ultranationalism, anti-modernism, and a deep dissatisfaction with liberal democracy. What complicates this question further is that it resists reduction to a single explanatory layer. It cannot be answered solely in theological terms, not purely in political ones. It requires attention to language, to symbolic structures, to historical context, and to the lived experiences of those who participated in or were affected by these theological transformations. The broader context of this inquiry explicitly invites a critical engagement with the confiscation of Orthodox Christianity by extremist political movements in the interwar period. In this sense, the legionary movement offers not only a case study, but a particularly revealing one, precisely because it does not operate at the level of explicit doctrinal reinterpretation, but rather is the level of symbolic and conceptual displacement. The central claim guiding this sketch is intentionally modest. It is not that orthodoxy leads to violence, but that under certain historical and ideological conditions, ambiguities in the religion's language can be mobilized and in ways that makes violence intelligible and sometimes even appear justified. Methodological clarification between ideology and analysis. Before moving further, a methodological distinction must be clearly stated. That the sources available for this topic fall into very different categories. Primary ideological text, example Codreanu, Gărcineanu, Sfințescu, Bernea, which articulated the internal self-understanding of the movement. To this must be added a broader corpus of legionary and pro-legionary literature, which includes not only canonical figures such as Cornelius Elea Codreanu, but also authors such as Constantin Papanace, Ion Veverca, Vasile Marin, Ion Banea, Radu Gir, Nicolae Totu, Ernest Bernea, Ion Protopopescu, Victor Șoimu, Ioan Boacă, Stelian Stănicel, Horia Sima, Mardarie Popinciuc, Ion Mânzatu, Nicolae Arnautu, among others. These texts constitute an extended collection of primary sources which must be approached with caution. They do not offer neutral descriptions, but rather normative visions, rhetorical constructions, and ideological narrative that aim to shape perception rather than reflect the reality. For example, in Petru Legionari, Codreanu explicitly frames the movement not as a political, but as a spiritual struggle, a language that already signals a shift from political contestation to existential conflict. Critical and scholarly analysis, Ornea, Ioanid, Clark, Stone, Ansel, Veiga, Heinemann, Dilettant, which contextualize, interpret, and often problematize those ideological constructors. One of the most striking features that emerges when reading legionary texts is not the presence of religious language per se, but its gradual displacement. Concepts such as nation, sacrifice, salvation, purity retain their religious resonance, but begin to operate in different semantic field. They are no longer confined to spiritual life. They begin to overlap with political action. Zigu Ornea analysis of the 1930 intellectuals climate is particularly helpful here. He shows how orthodoxies became a key component of an exclusionary national identity, often linked to anti-modern and anti-liberal position. In this context, orthodoxy is no longer simply a religious tradition. It becomes a marker of belonging and explicitity of exclusion. The language of sacrifice and the reframing of violence. Roland Clark's works demonstrates how rituals, commemorations, and symbolic practices within the movement reinforce a culture of heroic suffering and collective destiny, in which that could be reinterpreted as a meaningful within a large narrative of national redemption. At the same time, Radu Ioanid shows that the symbolic framework coexisted with and at times facilitated forms of anti-Semitic violence and political extremism. The key point here is not the violence is directly commanded by religious doctrine, but that it becomes thinkable within a transformed conceptual horizon. The most significant conceptual shift pertains to the nation of sacrifice. In Christian theology, sacrifice is commonly linked to giving of oneself, pain, and salvation. But in religionary discourse, the phrase becomes to mean two things: self-sacrifice, martyrdom, dedication to a greater cause, and killing the enemy for that cause. Sacrifice will still refers to martyrdom and devotion, but it can also extend less directly, but quite noticeable, toward the idea that others may be sacrificed in the name of the same cause. Violence in this sense is not simply as an action. It becomes thinkable within a reconfigured moral and symbolic horizon. The role of collective identity and exclusion. The transformation of religion language is closely linked to the construction of a collective identity defined in increasingly exclusive terms. As Orthodoxy notes, some interword discourses reduce to the Romanian soul to Orthodoxy, effectively excluding other religious communities from the national body. This process has two consequences. One, it strengthens international cohesion. Two, it legitimizes exclusion. In extreme cases, exclusion can become radicalized into dehumanization, justification of violence. The regional case is in a broader European context too. The Romanian case should not be treated in isolation. The legionary movement can be seen as one instance of more general phenomenon, the reworking of religious traditions within modern political ideologies. Ritual, discipline, and embodiment of meaning. Clarke's analysis is particularly illuminating when it turns to the role of rituals and discipline. What might appear at first glance as a political organizations reveal itself upon closer inspection as sometimes closer to a community of formation. Within it, members are not only mobilized, they are shaped. Their bodies, their habits, their perceptions are gradually aligned with a shared vision. Rituals, whether religious services, commemorations of the dead, or collective activities, play a crucial role in this process. What is important here is not simply that a religion is present, but that it's performed. It is enacted in ways that blur the distinction between spiritual life and political engagement. Clarke notes that the Legion combined political assassination, street violence, anti-Semitic hate speech, romantic nationalism, religious symbolism, and charity project. This juxtapositions is striking, but it's not accidental. It reflects a form of integration in which different domains, religious, social, political, are no longer clearly separated. Violence in this context does not appear as an external addition to an otherwise coherent system. It is woven into a broader fabric of meaning. It is not always foregrounded, not always justified explicitly, but it's made compatible with other elements of the worldview. This compatibility is perhaps the most important thing to understand. It is not that violence is constantly celebrated. It is that it's no longer incommensurably with the rest of the system. Historical sickness. When ideas meet social crisis, at a certain point it becomes necessary to slow the analysis down even further and allow the historical context to press more heavily on the conceptual framework. There is always a risk in discussions of ideological language to treat meanings as if they moved freely, almost autonomously. But in reality, they do not move in empty space. They move through situations, often tense, unstable, and deeply unsettling situation. The interwar Romanian context is precisely such a situation. What emerges from both Ioanid reconstructions and Orne intellectual history is a society marked by, first, rapid modernization, unevenly distributed political instability, economic anxiety, unresolved tension around national identity, and importantly, the persistence of older symbolic frameworks that had not been displaced but rather reactivated. Ioanid works makes it clear that a legionary ideology cannot be separated from a broader matrix of anti-Semitism, social frustration, and ideological radicalization. This is not an abstract background. It is the very condition of which certain ideas begin to resonate. In such a context, to appeal to orthodoxy does not function simply as a theological reference. It becomes a stabilizing horizon, a way of encouraging meaning in a world perceived as disorder. But, and this is the crucial point, the same stabilizing function can, under pressure, turn into something else. It can become a mechanism of closure, a way of defining not only who belongs, but who does not. The subtitle shift from meaning to legitimacy. There is a moment difficult to locate precisely, but essential, when meaning begins to slide into legitimacy. At first, religious language provides a vocabulary of understanding the world. It offers orientation, coherence, a sense of place. But gradually and almost imperceptibly, it begins to something more. It starts to authorize certain forms of action. This does not happen through explicit commands. It happens through alignment. When the nation is imagined as sacred, sacrifice is valorized as the highest form of commitment. Suffering is framed as redemptive, and history is interpreted as a moral struggle. Then certain conclusions begin to appear, not as a deduction, but as intuitions. Clarke's detailed attention to legionary practice is particularly helpful here. What he shows, especially in these later chapters, is that the movement cultivated a form of moral intensification in which ordinary distinctions begin to weaken. Violence in this setting does not appear as a rupture. It appears as a continuation under different conditions. This is perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Not that the violence is justified in a crude or explicit way, but that it becomes compatible with a system that otherwise presents itself as ethical, spiritual, even sacrificial. A final return to initial question I propose now. If we now return once again to the question with which we began, it may appear slightly different. We are no longer asking, how did orthodoxy justify violence, but rather, under what conditions did certain uses of orthodox language make violence appear meaningful? This shift matters. It allows us to avoid both accusation and denial and to remain within a space of analysis. The answer, as it emerges from the material, is not singular. It involves historical crisis, ideological reconfigurations, symbolic displacement, emotional investment, and collective practice. None of these elements is sufficient on its own, but together they form a configuration that makes certain developments possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcu. If there are any questions until then, if I may ask you, what do you think that brings all these elements together? That you said individually are not enough, but when they come together.
Yes, I'm referring the period that we are talking about, the interwar. There was a time where I guess a lot of elements were colluded into what we are using to say that it was a legionary movement and extremist forces. And the history of Romania between the First World War and Second World War was full of these conflicts, the social conflicts. So that's why I'm thinking that it's not a question of individuals. Even a lot of Romanian intellectuals, as you already know, like Eliade, Cioran, Noica, are writing about a legionary, and there was very close to the movement in their works, especially in the first years of the legionary movement. The Romanian society were cultivated to have this kind of forms of political reflections, because there was a lot of poor populations in the Asian country between the wars, the First and the Second World Wars. So I guess there was a lot of let's say motives and a lot of roots that conducted to this kind of explosion of violence. And I'm afraid, and unfortunately, the Orthodox Church contributed with full hands to this kind of situation, political situation, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much.
This is indeed one of the explanations already discussed in recent years, and I would like to thank you for proposing and presenting to this colloquium, and to mention last year, almost on the same dates, we had the keynote lecture by Professor Roland Clark from the University of Liverpool, and he indeed discussed about the phenomenon of Maglavit 1935. And I guess it would be just to answer somehow your basic question, and I would like to thank you also for sending us your communication, the draft of it, for discussion among our members. And Stefan questions, and your foremost question, how violence arrives at being conceived as a theological element of doctrine, and to invent this religious fascism of Romanians. I would like to quote one famous scholar of religion of Peruvian ascendance, and an American scholar, very famous in the early days of the European Association, namely Professor Gustavo Benavides, who in that Tübingen Brill volume on the study of religion during fascism, 1933-1945, edited by Professor Horst Junginger, at that time professor at the University of Tübingen. Gustavo, a friend of the Romanian Association since so many years, and one of the cleverest persons in the field, asked about how, what is properly agency in such phenomena. How the Italian fascists and the Nazis wanted to extract the heroic deed through irrationality. The element of irrationality, which is present almost on a daily basis, at least in Romania, because of the Dracula legacy, perhaps, this irrational element, may somehow explain how the early legionaries, I mean the formation of the so-called doctrine, the so-called manifest, etc., their first moves, anti-Semitic in northern Moldavia, throwing from the trains every single guy who, while asked, they replied, yes, indeed, I'm a Jew, and they expelled them from the trains violently, already in 1922, 1923. The irrational element was present in the nascence of fascist movements across Europe, including the Ustash in Croatia, not only the more famous Italians, and not only Mussolini and SS Ahnenerbe in Germany, not only Evola being even more irrational than the Nazis, that the Nazis decided to expel Evola across the Alps because he was more Nazis than them. This irrational element, which explains the violence of the Romanian Holocaust in Moldavia and in Iași, at a moment in 1941 when the Nazi officers of Iași were bewildered by the impossible violence and irrationality of the Romanian soldiers slaughtering Jews on the streets. Even they considered that this type of anti-Semitism, it's a bit too much for the Nazi, very anti-Semitic from the beginning doctrine. I would like to insist a bit about the irrational, not only because the interwar period had a problem with this, even simultaneously with the discovery of the more profound levels of the human beings, of the animal beings, or human-animal beings. That's it, the discovery of psychoanalysis, the discoveries of Jung, and the discovery of certain other religious cultures which practiced lessons from exploring the subconscious, individual or collective, as the ancient and medieval Indians did, while talking about vasana, about the impregnations, which are similar to perfumes, which last more than the vehicle or the small recipients where the perfumes were collected. This irrational dimension, because violence, the perturbation, the title of the colloquium, the diversions, the manipulations are indeed at times violently irrational. And I wonder if the analysis of Gustavo Benavides explained indeed also he is conversant with some international literature on the legionary movement in interwar Romania as it standed 1 decade ago or so. But nowadays we do have many more archival resources immediately available. We can compare how a significant portion of the clergy, the Orthodox Church clergy, during the campaign of 1936, they not only supported the legend, but they represented as possibly to be elected members of the future parliament. They were more than a third. The problem of sanctifying the lives of possible pseudo-heroes from the legend, as Mozart and Marin, with the extraction of the irrational, the heroic deed through irrational actions, including foremost violence, in a world which started to learn what non-violence, ahimsa, anuvatama, was, corresponds to some developments from the 1990s, because having in a religious calendar one saint who wrote dozens and dozens of anti-Semitic and turbid, violently, textually violent articles against minorities, against other creeds, against everyone who would not have been immediately a legionary. This started already with a new level of violence and irrational moves during those 4-5 months of legionary in power, September 1940, January 1941, when the legionaries themselves pressed the synod and the patriarchate of the newly autocephalous Orthodox Church to have Zelea Codreanu, Moța, Marin, and others who died in Mahada Honda in the Franco War, to have them sanctified and included in the Orthodox calendar. At that moment, and this is my last intervention on this topic, at that moment, November, December 1940, hopefully, the religious authorities of Romania refrained, postponed the requests, and finally left the problem unsolved to the post-communist Romania. Thank you so much. Sorry for this a bit longer comment. And for the last 2 episodes of our meeting today, I would like to invite you to go 3 floors upstairs to see the Institute for those who were not our guests before, and to see library and the manuscripts related to the topic of today's meeting. I would like to thank you warmly, all of you, and especially Professor Jenny Butler, for coming and delivering that wonderful morning lectures, which was a delight for the young group of scholars of religion from Bucharest. Thank you so much, and see you all soon.
Thank you very much.